multiculturalism, citizenship and immigration, employment and social development, and national defence. Please welcome Premier Kenney.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be back to RMA for your spring meeting, and I hope you've been having a good time here in Edmonton. I want to thank Paul and for the invite, and all of the ministers who are here, or just about the whole provincial cabinet, and I guess you'll be hearing from some of them later on. And I see our Minister for Rural Economic Development and Ag right in the front there, Nate Horner, who I think has been hanging around the halls here a lot. So, since I last spoke to you in the fall, a lot has changed. The world has changed. And I want to speak a bit about the implications of that for our province. Of course, the biggest and most disturbing change has been Vladimir Putin's illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine. I want to thank all of you, your communities and constituents, for the ways in which you have shown some solidarity for Ukraine over these past 3 unbelievable weeks. But we owe so much to Ukraine and Ukrainians as Albertans. They helped to settle this province in this part of the world. And the ties, the human and real ties, continue to go back very strong. In fact, this whole thing is been very emotional for me. I, as Minister of National Defence, deployed the Canadian military for the first time ever to Ukraine back in 2015 to help address the training of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. It's made a big difference since then to help them professionalize and modernize their military, and we can see the difference as they bravely hold off this brutal and total invasion from one of the largest militaries in the world. So, and Alberta is doing what we can practically to demonstrate our support. We've contributed $6 million of emergency humanitarian aid through the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, $6 million of support through the World Ukrainian Congress to buy non-lethal military equipment, flak jackets, helmets, night vision goggles, and the like. And as well, we've given some support to the local Ukrainian community here to organize their relief efforts and to prepare to welcome possible Ukrainian refugees. On that point, we can expect some newcomers, and I want to encourage all of your communities to do what you can to welcome those who may arrive here to begin Canadian lives, or at least to live here in security until they can go home. So we pray for Ukraine, and we'll continue to do what we can to demonstrate our support. We've removed any investments from AIMCO that were in Russian assets. We've removed Russian products from AGLC. There's only so much that we as a provincial government can do. But the implications of the invasion, of course, are worldwide, and they're real for us here in Alberta. First of all, the world is beginning to see what we have been saying for years as Albertans, that we need more responsible Alberta Canadian energy on global markets to compete with and displace conflict oil coming from the world's worst regimes like Putin's Russia, like the dictatorship in Iran, the socialist dictatorship in Venezuela, and the OPEC dictatorships, because we see a growing global embargo on Russian energy. They are the world's second largest producer, 10 million barrels a day. They export half of that, 5% of world energy bought around the globe. And Europe has tragically become dependent on Russian energy imports. So very painful for them to get off the addiction to that dictator oil. But friends, we must encourage our allies around the world to stop fueling Putin's war machine. Every barrel of Russian oil that is bought is filled with Ukrainian blood. And that is a message we have been sending for years. Now, I was down in Houston last week at the world's largest oil and gas conference to send a very clear message that while I was there, President Biden announced the U.S. embargo on Russian energy, and then he's now pleading with the socialist dictatorship in Venezuela to replace that source. He's planning on traveling to Saudi Arabia to beg the king to produce and ship more, and they're lifting sanctions on Iranian oil exports. The message I sent to our American friends, and I do every day speaking to senior members of the American Congress, is Replacing Russian dictator oil with Iranian, Saudi, or Venezuelan dictator oil is no better for the world or for U.S. national security. The solution to these problems of energy supply and security is right next door, and Calgary's a lot closer to Washington than Riyadh, right here in Alberta. I cannot understand why the President of the United States vetoed a pipeline that would have brought nearly 900,000 barrels a day of responsibly produced, reliable energy from the America's closest friend and ally, only to be dependent on OPEC dictatorships. It makes no sense. But I think the winds of change are blowing. There was a poll yesterday in the United States, 77% of Americans support Keystone XL, and we are determined. We are determined to do whatever it takes to get more Alberta energy to stabilize global security, and I think we have a path forward. We've seen the completion of Enbridge Line 3, nearly 400,000 barrels a day. We've got a couple of 100,000 barrels of extra space in the system right now. There's pipeline optimization and line reversals that are possible. TMX should be done next year, plus 500,000 barrels a day. But we will not relent, because this isn't, you know what? People say to me, well, Jason, building another pipeline or getting LNG to the east and the west coast to replace dictator gas, it's not going to happen overnight, not going to stop the conflict in Ukraine. Maybe that's true. But maybe we should, as Canadians, start thinking the long game, just as Vladimir Putin did. His invasion didn't start 3 weeks ago. It started 8 years ago when he invaded Crimea and the Donbass. This guy's been planning this for a decade. Maybe we Canadians should stop being Boy Scouts and start being realists, start acting like a real country with the third largest oil reserves on Earth, and act like it as though this is a matter of national and international urgency. That's what we call on Justin Trudeau to do. And on another implication of what's happening in Europe today is relevant to so many of you and your constituents, and that is we're not just going to see a crisis in global energy markets, but also in global food markets. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Europe turned off a third of its fertilizer production. Why? Because of unaffordable natural gas as feedstock for fertilizer. Now, when you produce less fertilizer, you get lower yields. When you get lower yields, you get more food scarcity, prices go up. And then you add on to this what will likely be at least this year, removing Russia and Ukraine from global food exports, and they represent 15 to 20% of global production. We are going to see likely the highest food prices in the global markets in our lifetimes. And I know it's going to be a challenging time for Alberta farmers, but we are going to need Alberta ag like we've never needed it before. And this government stands with our farmers, ranchers, our food processors and producers to do the job. Now, we know the input costs are going up, but so too will prices. And so I know that Nate and his team stand at the ready to make sure that we are working with our producers, grains, oilseeds, livestock, and the entire industry to make sure that Alberta is part of the solution. We can be a big part of the solution to global energy scarcity, but also global food scarcity as well. And agriculture is going to mean a lot more to our economy this year than it has in many, many years. Now, another big thing that's changed is our hope and my belief that the worst of COVID is behind us. This thing that has it started 2 years ago, pretty much today. This whole thing that has turned our lives upside down for 2 years and disrupted not just our lives, but people in every part of the world. And I just want to say thank you all for your forbearance and patience as we got through this tough time. None of us had a textbook for this. As leaders, it challenged all of us, all of you. And sadly, it resulted in a lot of division in our province, in our communities, in our families, our faith groups, I'm sure your municipal councils, in our provincial government. There has been division. There's been division because everybody has had at least one opinion on how best to deal with COVID. And sometimes each person's had two or three, depending on when you asked them. Everybody's had an opinion about restrictions and vaccines and all of it. And sadly, there's been a great deal of division in our society. But let me just say this. You know, we've had, in this debate in this province, we had a huge number of people over here saying that this government, the Alberta government, was too reluctant to bring in public health measures and too eager to drop them, and that we are therefore responsible for a terrible disaster. And then there are others on the other side who say that this government was far too eager to bring in restrictions and far too reluctant to lift them, and is therefore responsible for damage done on that side. The truth is this, folks. We tried our best, without a textbook, to navigate, admittedly through trial and error, the least damaging approach that we could. Had we listened to the let her rip crowd, people say, Jason, why couldn't you be like Governor DeSantis, Florida, just let it go? Well, first of all, Florida has 3 times more ICU beds than we do. The Americans spend a lot more money than we do on health care. But secondly, Florida at this point has 3 times more COVID deaths per person than we do. They say, why couldn't you be like Kristi Noem in South Dakota? She didn't have any restrictions. True. She also had 5 times more deaths than we did per capita, which would be not 4,000 as in Alberta, but upwards of 20,000 deaths. Folks, I don't think Albertans would have accepted that. And I know that our hospitals couldn't have. There were days, and you need to hear this from me, there were days when there was sitting on my desk in September a authorization for triage protocols. Had we gone about 30 more people in ICU, we would have run out of our maximum stretch capacity. By signing that, we would have been airlifting people to Toronto, pulling life support on others and denying others care, asking relatives to care for their dying family members in overflow ICU facilities. I had the chief coroner call my office and ask for permission to rent freezer trailers as backup morgues because he was running out of space. So I'm speaking to you very bluntly because I know many of you were deeply frustrated with restrictions, and so was I. So were all of us who had to make these decisions. But do you think any of that would have been a responsible or defensible decision? As somebody who believes in the sanctity of human life, I absolutely do not. And on the other side, the usual suspects were demanding that we shut everything down from day one, hard lockdown. And if other people had been making the decisions, we would have been like Quebec or Australia or New Zealand and had the schools and businesses shut for the better part of 2 years, stay-at-home orders and curfews and police on every street corner checking your papers. But imagine what the damage would have been, not just to the exercise of rights and freedoms, but to people's mental, emotional, and financial well-being. It would have been totally unacceptable. And so what we did was to seek a sensible middle ground, and we exit, we believe, the worst of this with a lower fatality rate per capita than Canada, about 1/3 of the United States, and 1/2 of Europe's, and we did that with less damaging restrictions than the vast majority of those jurisdictions. I think this speaks well to the responsibility and diligence of Albertans, especially our frontline healthcare workers. Let's give them a round of applause for all that they have done. As I say, with population protection, new treatments, and everything else, I do believe that the worst is behind us. Another thing that has changed, though, is as we emerge from COVID, and by the way, it's not over, there will be future waves, but we have good reason to believe that the worst is behind us, as the rest of the world believes. But as we emerge from that, I say, let's leave the division in the past. We can decide to spend the rest of our lives, and your time and our time in office, arguing over this, you know, picking fights and settling scores and doing the Monday morning quarterback routine on this whole thing. Or we can decide to let it recede in the rearview mirror as we look through the windshield as a bright new day is dawning on this province, a day of economic renewal, a day of enormous population growth. I think more than a day, but likely several years of prosperity. Let's embrace that opportunity, that future, as leaders of this province. And folks, if you don't believe me, You know, last year we led Canada in economic growth. I told you about that in the fall. We also ended the year with 130,000 net new jobs created. This year, everybody says we're going to lead in growth again in jobs and the economy. And if you don't believe me, just look at the budget that Travis Taze tabled 11 days ago, the first balanced budget in 8 years, the second in 14 years. Alberta's finances and Alberta's economy are back on track. Now, some people say, well, Jason, that's just lucky run on commodity prices. Well, it sure hasn't hurt. But, folks, a big part of this was spending discipline. And some of that may have ticked some of you guys off because we've had to say no to some of the needs and demands and requests from every sector in the past 3 years to get our finances under control. We were spending 20% more per person than other provinces. We'd have that now down to the average. So we're now operating as efficiently as other Canadian provinces. We basically held our spending flat for 3 years. And it was hard. And we lost support, and we took some people off in the process. But that's what you have to do. If you're going to be responsible leaders, you have to make difficult and responsible decisions. If the previous government spending track was still carrying on at 5% annual increases in spending, we would have a $6 billion deficit this year, an $8 billion deficit in 2 years. We would have permanent structural deficits, and we would be mortgaging the future of the province, sinking into a sea of red ink that we could never get out of. Instead, because of that spending discipline, with recovery on commodity prices and economic growth, we've seen this huge turnaround, the fastest fiscal turnaround in the province's history. It's not just commodity prices, though. We're seeing revenues grow dynamically from every source, in every sector and in every region, because this economy is firing on pretty much all cylinders. Really, the only sectors that are not fully back are travel and tourism, and that's why we will be debating a motion in the Legislative Assembly this evening calling on Justin Trudeau to drop his pointless travel restrictions immediately. Folks, the economy last year, we finished out best year ever in digital information technology, venture capital, and we have twice as many information technology companies operating here as when our government took office 3 years ago. Just yesterday, I got off the phone with the CEO of one of the world's largest tech companies, who told me later this month they'll be announcing that Alberta will be hosting a major global center of excellence for that company. Hundreds more tech jobs. It just keeps coming. Last year was the best year ever for venture capital. I've already mentioned that, but for manufacturing, believe it or not. And the best year ever for exports. Last year was the best year ever for film and television, 10-fold increase in film and television productions. And I know a lot of you have seen that HBO production, The Last of Us, shooting in different parts of the province, the largest film production in Canadian history. Last year was the best year ever in Alberta forestry. Canfor called me just before Christmas. They're the biggest lumber company in Canada. And they told me they were shutting down 3 mills in BC because BC has anti-business regulations and uncertainty around Indigenous consultation and all sorts of other problems. But they bought 3 mills in Alberta because they said publicly that this government is open for business and we support the forestry industry. More investment is coming. Last year, even though there was really bad weather, and this is not to diminish the adversity of many of our food producers, but last year we had the highest level of revenues ever in Alberta agriculture, and we're now at, I think, $860 million in new investment in food processing in the province. And this year will undoubtedly be the best year ever in the history of our energy industry. Last month we shipped 4.1 million barrels of Alberta oil out of this province, a record high. None of these things are happening by accident. All of these things are in part because Alberta has been laser focused on restoring investor confidence, on creating the best possible economic conditions, reducing business taxes, reducing red tape, creating incentives for huge new investment. I didn't even mention $18 billion of investment announced in petrochemicals, much of that in this part of the province, all of it guaranteeing future demand for upstream oil and gas exploration and production, midstream pipeliners, service companies all across rural Alberta. And we're hot on the trail of another $12 billion of investment in petchems, thanks to the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, the lower taxes, the flexibility of munis to provide tax incentives, the one-stop shopping in terms of pre-approved regulatory zones, the infrastructure that we're building, and so much more. And perhaps most exciting, $6 billion of projects announced in hydrogen, which is a future multi-trillion-dollar industry. None of this is happening by accident. And I want to thank you. When I first came to RMA in this job, I asked that we all work together, row together in the same direction to economic growth. And I know so many of you have been making really tough decisions to trim and control your spending so you could keep your taxes down, or in some cases actually reduce them. Many of you, I want to give Wheatland County a shout out. They have just one great example of a Reeve and council who have had a killer instinct to bring in new investment. We've been working with them, and I think we are within weeks of announcing potentially 2 major manufacturing projects in that county, which will add over 1,300 permanent jobs and help us diversify Alberta's economy. Thank you, Wheatland. Thank you, all of you, for what you are doing. County of Greenview. Oh, I could go on all day, but County of Greenview, what you did to bring in that new petchem project up there in your county, and your whole vision about the pre-approved regulatory zone. I mean, there are so many great stories in this room about how we've been cooperating on building Alberta's economic future. A big part of that is our capital investment. And so I'm happy today to announce that coming out of Budget 2022, Alberta's capital plan for the next 3 years is for $20.2 billion to modernize and maintain public infrastructure to build the architecture of our future economy. And yes, please, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of your money. That's $1.8 billion for road projects, for example, that are already on an annualized basis. Things like the new highway over the Peace River near Lacrete, the twinning of Highway 3 between Taber and Burdett down south. And I don't know if Grant Hunter's here, but he's going to be leading a special project to make the most out of that ag corridor. Highway 1120 between Sylvan and Rocky, the David Thompson Highway. Highway 4020 south of GP. Highway 2nd and 40th Avenue interchange near Airdrie, and so much more. $3.2 billion in capital repair and maintenance. $1.7 billion of this is going to you guys through MSI and the local government fiscal framework. 66 schools that we're building or modernizing. We just made the announcement about that. Rural broadband. This is really exciting for your communities. We, as you know, have now announced $390 million provincial tax dollars going into getting us to 98% coverage for reliable high-speed internet across the province, and we've managed to get that twinned from the feds. By the way, people say to me, why aren't you doing more to stand up for Alberta with Ottawa? Well, we have a lot of wins, and that's a good example. It's not just about fighting, it's also about winning. Let's celebrate our victories. When we get $500 million from the feds to help us build out high-speed, reliable infrastructure for internet so we can connect rural Albertans to the future digital economy, improve services for ag and business, for health and education, that's a win. And we're also getting the telcos to come up with more money as well. Within 3 years, we are going to have 98% coverage for reliable high-speed internet all across the province and in your communities. That is good news. Now, I know Paul's about to get out the hook here, so let me talk about one issue that I know continues to be a challenge for so many of you, and that's unpaid property tax, unpaid linear tax from energy companies. As you know, our government passed legislation last year to allow for you to put liens against companies that have unpaid taxes. But I understand there's still a lot of that $250 million that's unpaid. Now, a lot of those companies that have those unpaid taxes don't exist any longer. They've gone into bankruptcy, but many of them do exist. And so we hear you. Thank you for continuing to raise this issue. People have an obligation, a legal and a moral obligation, to pay their taxes. And you've been very patient through the tough years when many of those companies, especially the mature, dry, shallow gas producers, were barely able to stay afloat. So you were patient, we were patient. But at these commodity prices, there's no more excuses. These companies have got to pay what they owe you, period, full stop, and we will work with you to make sure that that happens. And I guess, finally, I should address the biggest issue that's on the minds of most Albertans, and that's the cost of living. As inflation goes up, food costs, supply chain problems, energy, huge energy inflation, these are real issues, bread and butter issues that affect people in all of our communities. And that's why Alberta's government, unlike any in Canada, is taking real action immediately to address the cost of living. That is why, on April the 1st, Alberta is scrapping its provincial fuel tax, saving 13 cents on a litre. Now, that's as long as prices are high. That triggers in at $80 WTI. Right now, today, I think last I checked, we're trading at 96. And in addition, we are providing a $150 rebate on people's utility bills to reflect the high cost of electricity back in the winter months, and we'll get that through onto those people's utility bills as soon as the electricity companies can. But you know, at the same time, Justin Trudeau plans on raising his carbon tax on the same day, on April the 1st. So we're paddling in one direction, he's paddling the canoe in exactly the opposite. This makes no sense. Why would a federal government raise fuel costs in the midst of some of the highest inflation that we have seen in 40 years? When people are being pushed into energy poverty, when some families can't afford to fill up their gas tank or heat their homes or turn on the power, pay the utility bills. Why? And I'll tell you why. Because for Trudeau and his allies, higher energy prices is not the problem, it's the solution. That's why they have carbon taxes. They are actually trying to make energy less affordable. Friends, if some good can come out of this crazy policy, it will wake up Central Canadians to what we Westerners have been saying for years. And hopefully that will be reflected, I hope, sorry to get political, but at a federal ballot box sometime, where Central Canadians say, you know, they don't produce this energy, but they sure do consume it. And I hope and believe that we may be seeing an inflection point in Canadian politics that is waking people up to the need for a sane energy policy that leads to ample and affordable, reliable energy in Canada. And I hope we're seeing the beginning of the end of the consensus around policies like carbon tax, which are only going to, by the way, further inflate the cost of fertilizer and input costs for farmers, accelerating food inflation. And these things have very real consequences. They may cause some real adversity here. But folks, this is a moral question. You know, Canada sends billions of dollars of foreign aid for food security, for the poorest of the poor around the world. Meanwhile, policies like the carbon tax and the inability to get pipelines built are driving up input costs, which will increase food inflation to a point where people around the world will not be able to afford food. This is not just an Alberta economic issue, this is a global moral issue. So enough already with policies designed deliberately to push people into energy poverty. Billions of people in the world are already living in energy and food poverty. We need to reduce the cost of energy, increase its export, reduce the cost of food. And that's, once again, I'll just close by saying Alberta can be a big part of that. We want to continue to be partners with you, the rural leadership of this province. So much of what I've talked about, the infrastructure investments, record infrastructure investments, these new private sector investments, the heavy industry stuff that's coming in, the petrochemicals, the hydrogen, the carbon capture, utilization and storage, the newfound resilience and dynamism of our energy sector, the huge investments in agriculture, so much of the film and television, the broadband investments for connectivity and digital in your communities. So much of this is about rural Alberta, in addition to what we're investing in services by expanding healthcare, capital and education facilities all across rural Alberta. Folks, this government has not been perfect. We've made mistakes. We made mistakes through COVID. We ask for your patience and forbearance. They were impossibly difficult decisions to make. But, as I say, we emerge out of that difficult time with bright days that lie ahead. Let's seize that future. Let's be Albertans. We are natural optimists. We've got a lot of good reasons for our optimism right now. So thank you very much. God bless you, and good luck. I was right on time.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you.